The hospital bracelet cut into Maya's wrist as she pressed her palms against the cold observation window, watching her sister Rachel pace frantically in the psychiatric ward below, convincing doctors that Maya was dangerous, unstable, a threat to herself and others. The irony tasted like copper pennies in Maya's mouth. Creating this intense psychological story takes tremendous time and effort to research and craft. If you're gripped by Maya's journey, please like this video and subscribe for more true stories of resilience. "She's asking for you again," Dr. Morrison said softly, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had witnessed this particular brand of family devastation too many times. His lab coat rustled as he moved closer to the window, clipboard tucked under his arm. "She keeps saying she needs to apologize, that she has to explain something important about the birds." Maya's reflection stared back at her from the glass. 28 years old, dark circles under green eyes that had once been bright with ambition, auburn hair pulled back in a messy bun that spoke of sleepless nights and emergency phone calls. She wore the same purple cardigan she'd thrown on when the hospital called at 3 a.m, the one with the small hole near the left elbow that Rachel had always teased her about. The cardigan felt heavier now, weighted with the responsibility of being the stable sister, the one who had to make decisions about medication and treatment plans and whether supervised visits were safe. "The birds?" Maya repeated, her breath fogging the glass. She mentioned them during her intake evaluation, too. Something about how they were sending her messages through the window patterns. 3 months earlier, Rachel had stood in this same hallway, her voice steady and convincing as she spoke to Dr. Patterson about Maya's concerning behavior. Rachel had worn her navy business suit that day, the one she saved for important meetings at the marketing firm where she worked as a senior account manager. She'd carried a leather portfolio filled with printed emails, journal entries she claimed Maya had written, and a carefully compiled list of incidents that painted Maya as someone spiraling into paranoid delusions. "She's been saying our mother is still alive," Rachel had told Dr. Patterson, with the perfect mixture of concern and grief in her voice. "She talks to empty rooms, insists someone is moving things in her apartment, and she's convinced that her colleagues are plotting against her. Yesterday, she called me at 2 a.m, claiming that her neighbor was projecting voices through the walls." Maya had spent 72 hours in psychiatric hold, subjected to invasive questioning, medication she didn't need, and the humiliation of being treated like a dangerous patient rather than someone who had been betrayed by the person she trusted most. She had tried to explain about the water contamination case, about the legitimate nature of her research, but her protests were interpreted as further evidence of her delusions. The more she insisted she was telling the truth, the more convinced the staff became that she was deeply unwell. It had been Dr. Morrison, ironically, who had eventually seen through Rachel's deception. He had taken the time to verify Maya's employment, to contact her supervisor, to actually investigate the water contamination case she kept mentioning. When her boss, Jennifer Chen, confirmed that Maya was not only mentally stable, but had been doing exemplary work on a high-profile environmental case, the hospital had quietly released her with an apology and a recommendation for a second opinion. "Your sister was very convincing," Dr. Morrison had told Maya during her release interview. "She provided detailed documentation and seemed genuinely concerned for your welfare. But sometimes the people who know us best also know exactly how to hurt us most effectively." Now, staring down at Rachel through the observation window, Maya wondered if her sister had always been capable of such calculated cruelty, or if the paranoid delusions that were now consuming Rachel's mind had been building for months, twisting her love into something possessive and destructive. Rachel's current diagnosis was complex.
early onset schizophrenia with paranoid features, possibly triggered by stress and exacerbated by what appeared to be months of undiagnosed symptoms. The very symptoms that had driven her to project her own mental health struggles onto Maya, to create an elaborate fiction that painted her younger sister as the unstable one. "She's been asking about your mother a lot," Dr. Morrison continued, making notes on his clipboard. "She seems to believe that your mother is sending her messages through various environmental signs, birds flying in specific patterns, the way shadows fall across her room, the sound of water running through the pipes. She's convinced that these messages contain important information about protecting you from some kind of danger." Maya's chest tightened. Their mother, Elena, had been a middle school science teacher with a passion for environmental activism. She had taught both daughters to pay attention to the natural world, to notice patterns in weather and animal behavior, to understand the interconnectedness of ecosystems. Elena had often said that nature was constantly communicating with those who knew how to listen carefully, that birds and trees and water held wisdom for anyone willing to observe carefully. It seemed deeply tragic that Rachel's illness had twisted those beautiful childhood lessons into something frightening and paranoid. The mother who had taught them to find comfort in nature's rhythms had become, in Rachel's fractured mind, a ghostly presence sending cryptic warnings through the very environmental signs she had once helped them appreciate. "Has she mentioned why she thought I needed to be committed?" Maya asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I mean, her real reasons, not the story she told Dr. Patterson." Dr. Morrison hesitated, glancing at his notes. "She's been somewhat fragmented in her explanations, but she keeps returning to the idea that you were in danger from your work, that people were going to hurt you because of what you were discovering. In her current state, she believes that getting you admitted to the hospital was the only way to keep you safe from these perceived threats." Maya felt a cold recognition settle in her stomach. Before we continue with this shocking revelation, this complex story requires hours of research and careful storytelling. If you're invested in learning how this family crisis unfolds, please share this video and hit that subscribe button.
"It's possible," Dr. Morrison said carefully, "that her illness caused her to interpret your legitimate professional challenges as evidence of imminent danger. Paranoid delusions often contain kernels of reality that become distorted and magnified until they seem to justify extreme actions." Maya pressed her forehead against the cool glass, watching as Rachel stopped pacing and looked directly up at the observation window. Even from this distance, Maya could see the wild intensity in her sister's eyes, the way her dark hair hung in unwashed tangles around her face, the hospital gown that made her look fragile and lost. Rachel raised one hand and pressed it against the window from her side, creating a mirror image of Maya's gesture. For a moment, Maya could see traces of the sister she had grown up with, the one who had braided Maya's hair before school, who had taught her to drive in empty parking lots, who had held her while she cried after their first heartbreak. But there was something else there now, something desperate and fractured that made Maya's heart ache with a grief more complex than anything she had felt when their mother died. "She's my only family," Maya said, her voice cracking slightly. "Our father died 2 years ago, and we only had each other. She was my emergency contact, my power of attorney, the person I trusted more than anyone in the world. And she tried to have me committed." "Betrayal by someone we love is one of the most difficult experiences to process," Dr. Morrison said gently, "especially when that betrayal stems from mental illness rather than malicious intent. Your sister wasn't acting out of cruelty, Maya. She was acting out of a deeply distorted sense of protection."
Maya knew he was right, but the knowledge didn't ease the ache in her chest or the way her hands shook whenever she thought about those 72 hours in psychiatric hold. She had lost faith in her own perceptions, had begun to question whether her memories were reliable, whether her emotions were proportionate, whether the people around her were seeing something she couldn't see about her own mental state. Even now, standing in the hallway of the same hospital where she had been a patient 3 months ago, Maya felt a persistent anxiety that maybe Rachel had been right about something. Maybe there was some truth to the concerns that had driven her sister to such extreme measures. "Dr. Morrison," Maya said, turning away from the window, "I need to know something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. Is there any possibility that I actually do have some kind of mental illness? Is there any chance that Rachel saw something real, even if she was sick herself?" Dr. Morrison set down his clipboard and looked at Maya with the kind of direct attention that made her feel truly seen for the first time in months. "Maya, I've reviewed your case extensively. I have spoken with your employer, your friends, your therapist, and your primary care physician. I've read the reports from your time in hold and reviewed the documentation Rachel provided. You are not mentally ill. You were a victim of what we call gaslighting, a form of psychological manipulation that made you doubt your own perceptions and experiences." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Your sister's illness manifested in a particularly cruel way, causing her to target the person she loved most. But her accusations against you were symptoms of her own paranoid delusions, not accurate assessments of your mental health. The water contamination case you were working on was real. Your concerns about corporate malfeasance were valid. Your emotional responses to stress and betrayal were entirely normal." Maya felt something tight in her chest begin to loosen, but the relief was accompanied by a fresh wave of grief for what had been lost between her and Rachel. If her sister hadn't been sick, would she have been proud of Maya's work? Would she have supported her through the challenges of the investigation instead of using those challenges as evidence of mental instability? What happens now? How long will she need to be here? Will she ever understand what she did to me? Dr. Morrison glanced back toward the observation window, where Rachel had returned to her pacing. "Treatment for schizophrenia with paranoid features is a long-term process. With proper medication and therapy, many people with this diagnosis can achieve stability and lead meaningful lives. But recovery isn't linear. An insight, the ability to understand that certain thoughts and perceptions were symptoms of illness, can take time to develop."
He turned back to Maya. "As for whether she'll understand the impact of her actions on you, that's a more complex question. Even when people achieve insight about their symptoms, they may struggle with guilt and shame about things they did while they were unwell. Rebuilding trust and repairing relationships requires work from both people, and it's okay if you're not ready for that work yet." Maya nodded, feeling the weight of decisions she wasn't prepared to make. Should she visit Rachel? Should she participate in family therapy sessions? Should she maintain boundaries for her own mental health, even if that meant limiting contact with her only remaining family member? "There's something else you should know," Dr. Morrison said, his voice taking on a different tone. "Rachel has been asking us to contact someone named Marcus about her bird observations. She seems to believe this person will understand the significance of the messages she's receiving. Do you know who that might be?" Maya's blood went cold. Marcus Webb had been their mother's boyfriend during the last 2 years of her life, an ornithologist who had shared Elena's passion for environmental activism. He had been kind to Maya and Rachel, had taught them about bird migration patterns and the ways that environmental changes could be tracked through animal behavior. After Elena's death, Marcus had maintained occasional contact with the girls, sending them updates about conservation projects and scholarship opportunities. But Marcus had died in a hiking accident 4 years ago, something Rachel knew perfectly well because they had attended his memorial service together. If Rachel was asking the hospital to contact Marcus,
It meant her delusions included not just their deceased mother, but also their mother's deceased boyfriend. Marcus died 4 years ago, Maya told Dr. Morrison, watching his expression shift to one of concerned understanding. If she's asking you to contact him, that's another sign of how detached from reality she's become. Dr. Morrison made a note on his clipboard. Thank you for that information. It helps us understand the scope of her symptoms. Maya looked back through the observation window where Rachel had stopped pacing again and was staring intently at something near the ceiling. Following her gaze, Maya could see a small bird perched on the exterior ledge of a window, probably seeking shelter from the autumn wind. Rachel was watching the bird with an expression of intense concentration, as if she were trying to decode some vital message from its presence. The sight filled Maya with a grief so profound it felt like drowning. This was her sister, the person who taught her to be brave, who had helped her through college applications and job interviews and relationship disasters. This was the woman who held Maya's hand at their father's funeral just 2 years ago, who had promised they would take care of each other no matter what life brought. Now, Rachel was alone in a psychiatric ward, convinced that dead people were sending her messages through bird flight patterns. And Maya was the only person left who could make decisions about her care. The responsibility felt crushing, made worse by the knowledge that Rachel had used that same position of trust to try to destroy Maya's life just 3 months earlier. I don't know how to forgive her, Maya whispered, more to herself than to Dr. Morrison. I don't know how to love someone who hurt me that deeply, even if they were sick when they did it. Dr. Morrison was quiet for a long moment, allowing Maya's words to settle in the space between them. Outside, the bird on the window ledge took flight, and Rachel's gaze followed its path until it disappeared from view. Forgiveness isn't a requirement for compassion, Dr. Morrison said. You can want your sister to get better without being ready to trust her again. You can participate in her treatment without forgetting what she put you through. Healing doesn't always mean returning to the way things were before. Maya pulled her cardigan tighter around herself, feeling the weight of choices she had never wanted to make. Through the glass, Rachel had begun pacing again, but now she was muttering to herself, occasionally gesturing toward the empty window ledge where the bird had been perched.
Tomorrow, Maya would have to decide whether to attend the family therapy session Dr. Morrison had recommended. She would have to choose whether to bring Rachel the books and photos from home that she had been requesting, whether to sign consent forms for experimental treatments, whether to begin the long and uncertain process of rebuilding a relationship with someone who had weaponized their love against her. But for now, Maya simply stood at the observation window, watching her sister battle demons that no one else could see, and wondered if the birds Rachel was so desperate to decode might actually be carrying messages after all, not from their dead mother or Marcus, but from the part of Rachel's mind that still remembered how to love without destroying, how to protect without betraying, how to be a sister without becoming an enemy. The question that would haunt Maya through the sleepless nights ahead was whether that version of Rachel still existed, somewhere beneath the illness, waiting to be recovered, or whether it had been permanently lost in the maze of delusions that now defined her sister's reality. Maya's apartment felt different now, though nothing had physically changed since Rachel's breakdown 3 months ago. The same cream-colored walls, the same collection of succulents lined up along the kitchen windowsill, the same stack of environmental science journals on the coffee table that she never seemed to have time to read. But the space carried an invisible weight, as if the air itself had absorbed the trauma of betrayal and psychiatric holds and emergency phone calls in the middle of the night. She stood in her kitchen at 6:30 in the morning, the same time she had woken up every day for the past 3 months, watching coffee drip into the glass carafe of her French press. The routine had become sacred, a tether to normalcy in a life that had been fundamentally altered by her sister's illness. Coffee first,
then shower, then the 20-minute drive to Evergreen Environmental Consulting, where she would spend 8 hours pretending that her expertise in groundwater contamination was more compelling than the psychiatric crisis consuming her personal life. Her phone buzzed against the granite countertop, a text from her therapist, Dr. Sarah Chen, reminding her about their appointment that afternoon. Maya had started seeing Dr. Chen 2 months ago, after the nightmares began and she realized she needed help processing what Rachel had done to her. The therapy sessions had become another ritual, another way of imposing structure on a life that felt perpetually on the verge of chaos. The nightmares always followed the same pattern. Maya would be back in the psychiatric ward, but this time she couldn't convince anyone that she belonged in the outside world. The doctors would nod sympathetically while she tried to explain about the water contamination case, about Rachel's deception, about the evidence that proved her sanity. But in the dream, her words would come out scrambled and paranoid, confirming everyone's worst fears about her mental state. She would wake up with her heart racing, momentarily uncertain whether the nightmare was memory or imagination. Dr. Chen had explained that this was a common response to gaslighting, the persistent doubt about one's own perceptions, the fear that maybe the person who manipulated you was actually seeing something real about your mental state. Betrayal trauma, she called it, especially devastating when it came from someone you trusted completely. Maya poured coffee into her favorite mug, a ceramic piece glazed in shades of blue and green that Rachel had given her 3 Christmases ago. She had considered throwing it away after Rachel's attempt to have her committed, but something had stopped her. Maybe it was the memory of Rachel's face when she had presented the gift, the genuine joy in her expression as she explained that the colors reminded her of Maya's work protecting water systems. Or maybe it was the stubborn hope that someday they would be able to drink coffee together again, that Rachel would recover enough to understand what she had done and work toward making amends. The mug felt warm against Maya's palms as she stood at her living room window, watching the neighborhood wake up around her. Mrs. Patterson, from next door, was already in her garden tending to the late autumn flowers that would soon succumb to the first frost. The elderly woman had been one of Maya's strongest advocates during the crisis 3 months ago, providing character references to the hospital and offering to testify about Maya's mental stability if necessary.
"That girl is sharp as a tack," Mrs. Patterson had told Dr. Morrison during a phone call Maya later learned about. "Been living next to her for 5 years, and she's never shown a sign of anything but good sense and kindness. If someone's telling you she's dangerous, you better look real close at who's doing the telling." It had been Mrs. Patterson who first suggested that Maya might be a victim of manipulation rather than someone experiencing a mental health crisis. She had seen Rachel coming and going from Maya's apartment in the weeks before the psychiatric hold, had noticed how agitated and controlling Rachel seemed to become whenever Maya mentioned her work. "Your sister used to be such a sweet girl," Mrs. Patterson had said to Maya after her release from the hospital. "But these past few months, there was something different about her, something desperate and watchful. I thought maybe she was having trouble at work or in her personal life, but now I wonder if she was getting sick and taking it out on you." Maya took a sip of coffee and tried to remember when she first noticed changes in Rachel's behavior. Looking back, the signs had been there for months before the psychiatric hold. Subtle at first, then increasingly pronounced. Rachel had begun calling more frequently, ostensibly to check in, but really to interrogate Maya about her daily activities, her work projects, her interactions with colleagues. She had started dropping by Maya's apartment unannounced, claiming she was just in the neighborhood, but then spending hours going through Maya's mail, her computer, her personal belongings. At the time, Maya had interpreted this behavior as loving concern from a sister who had always been protective. After their parents' deaths, Rachel had naturally assumed the role of caretaker, the one who made sure Maya was eating enough, sleeping enough, not working too hard on her environmental consulting projects. It had seemed natural that Rachel would worry about the water contamination case, which had indeed attracted some negative attention from the chemical company Maya was investigating.
But now, with the perspective that came from understanding Rachel's illness, Maya could see how her sister's paranoid delusions had slowly built around the framework of genuine concern. Rachel had taken Maya's legitimate work challenges and transformed them into evidence of imminent danger. She had weaponized Maya's openness about stress and professional setbacks, using those conversations to build a case for mental instability. The cruelest part was how Rachel had isolated Maya from other sources of support in the process. She had convinced Maya that her friends wouldn't understand the complexity of the environmental case, that her colleagues might be compromised by corporate interests, that family therapy sessions with a neutral third party were unnecessary because we can work through anything together just like we always have. By the time Rachel made her move to have Maya committed, she had systematically undermined Maya's confidence in every relationship except their sisterhood. Maya had been emotionally dependent on Rachel in a way that made questioning her sister's perceptions feel like questioning reality itself. Maya's phone rang, interrupting her morning reflection. The caller ID showed Jennifer Chen, her supervisor at Evergreen Environmental. Maya hesitated before answering, still not entirely comfortable with phone calls that came before normal business hours. Since the psychiatric hold, unexpected calls triggered anxiety that something was wrong, that someone was questioning her competence or stability again. "Hey, Maya," Jennifer's voice was warm but professional. "I wanted to catch you before the day got crazy. The Morrison chemical case is going to court next month, and the attorneys want to schedule a prep session with you this week. Are you feeling up to that level of involvement?" Maya felt a familiar tightness in her chest. The Morrison chemical case was the water contamination investigation that had been central to Rachel's delusions about Maya's safety. It was also the case that ultimately vindicated Maya's professional judgment and exposed Rachel's accusations as symptoms of mental illness rather than legitimate concerns. "I'm ready," Maya said, though she wasn't entirely sure that was true. "My research was solid, and I want to see this through to completion."
"I know your research was solid," Jennifer replied, "but I also know you've been dealing with a lot of personal stress, and testifying in a high-profile case can be emotionally demanding. I want to make sure you have adequate support and that you're not pushing yourself too hard too fast." This was the delicate balance Maya had been navigating for 3 months, proving her professional competence while acknowledging that she had indeed been through trauma. Jennifer had been understanding and supportive throughout the crisis, but Maya still felt pressure to demonstrate that the psychiatric hold had been a temporary disruption rather than evidence of ongoing instability. "I appreciate your concern," Maya said carefully. "I think participating in the case will actually be helpful for me. It's a chance to focus on work that matters and to see concrete results from all the research I put in before everything happened with my sister." Jennifer was quiet for a moment. "How is Rachel doing? I know you've been dealing with her hospitalization on top of everything else." Maya felt the familiar ache in her chest that came whenever someone asked about Rachel. How do you explain that your sister is both sick and cruel, both victim and perpetrator, both someone who needs compassion and someone who caused profound harm? "She's getting treatment," Maya said finally. "It's a long process, and I'm trying to focus on my own healing while she works on hers." After hanging up, Maya realized that this conversation represented progress. 3 months ago, she would have been terrified that Jennifer's questions about her readiness were actually doubts about her competence. She would have interpreted Jennifer's concern as evidence that people still saw her as potentially unstable. Now, she could recognize genuine care and support, even when it came with appropriate professional caution. The shower provided another 20 minutes of routine. The hot water and familiar ritual of shampoo and soap created a meditative space where Maya could prepare mentally for the day ahead. She had learned to use these small pockets of time for what Dr. Chen called grounding exercises, focusing on sensory experiences that confirmed her presence in reality, her agency over her own body and choices.
As she dressed for work, Maya caught sight of herself in the full-length mirror on her bedroom door. She looked more like herself than she had in months. The dark circles under her eyes had faded, her posture was straighter, and there was an alertness in her expression that had been missing during the immediate aftermath of Rachel's betrayal. The purple cardigan she had worn to the hospital was hanging in her closet, clean and mended, but she found herself reaching for a different sweater, one that didn't carry the weight of traumatic associations. The drive to work took her through the downtown district where Rachel had lived before her hospitalization. Maya's route used to include a detour past Rachel's apartment building, a habit left over from years of spontaneous sister visits and shared lunches. Now, she took the highway bypass, avoiding the neighborhood entirely. Dr. Chen had suggested this wasn't avoidance, but rather healthy boundary setting, a way of protecting her emotional energy while she was still in recovery. At Evergreen Environmental, Maya felt the familiar satisfaction of walking into a space where her expertise was valued and her contributions were meaningful. Her office was small but filled with natural light, the walls covered with maps of local watersheds and photographs of environmental restoration projects. Her desk held neat stacks of soil composition reports and groundwater analysis data, the kind of detailed technical work that had always brought her a sense of purpose. Her colleague David knocked on her doorframe at 9:30, holding 2 cups of coffee and wearing the kind of tentative expression that meant he wanted to check in on her emotional state without overstepping professional boundaries. "He thought you might want a coffee refill," he said, settling into the chair across from her desk. "And I wanted to see how you're feeling about the Morrison chemical prep sessions. I know that case has some complicated associations for you." David had been Maya's closest colleague during the water contamination investigation, and he had also been one of the people who had supported her throughout the psychiatric crisis. Unlike some of their coworkers who had initially been uncertain about what to believe regarding Maya's mental health, David had never wavered in his confidence in her professional judgment and personal integrity.
"It's going to be emotional," Maya admitted, accepting the coffee gratefully. "But I think it's important for me to see it through. This case represents months of careful research, and the community deserves to have corporate polluters held accountable for their actions." David nodded. "The irony is that your sister's accusations about paranoia and conspiracy theories actually make your work on this case even more impressive in retrospect. You were investigating real corporate malfeasance while being gaslighted into believing your perceptions were unreliable. That takes incredible strength and professional integrity." Maya felt a wave of gratitude for David's perspective. He had a way of reframing her experiences that highlighted her resilience rather than her victimization. During the darkest period after Rachel's betrayal, when Maya had questioned everything about her own judgment and professional competence, David had been the one to remind her that her research had been meticulous, her conclusions sound, and her instincts about corporate cover-ups entirely accurate. "Have you heard anything about Rachel's treatment?" David asked gently. "I know you were struggling with how much contact to maintain with her." Maya stared out the window of her office, where a small garden provided a view of native plants and a bird feeder that attracted local species. Watching the birds had become a complicated experience since Rachel's hospitalization. On one hand, they reminded Maya of childhood lessons about nature's wisdom that her mother had shared with both daughters. On the other hand, they were now associated with Rachel's paranoid delusions about receiving messages through avian behavior. "She's asking to see me," Maya said. "The doctors think family therapy sessions might be helpful for her recovery, but they've also made it clear that I shouldn't participate unless I'm emotionally ready. I don't know how to tell when I'll be ready to face her." David was quiet for a moment, respecting the complexity of Maya's situation. "What would readiness look like for you? What would need to be different about how you feel or what you need before you could handle seeing her?" It was a good question, one that Maya had been avoiding because the answer felt overwhelming. "I think I need to stop being afraid of her," she said slowly. "Right now, even though I know she's sick and hospitalized and can't hurt me anymore, I'm still afraid that she'll find some way to manipulate me or make me doubt myself again.
I'm afraid that I'll walk into that hospital room and somehow become the person she convinced everyone I was. Unstable, paranoid, dangerous. David nodded thoughtfully. That makes perfect sense. She didn't just betray your trust, she attacked your fundamental sense of reality. Recovering from that kind of psychological manipulation takes time, and it's okay to protect yourself while you're still healing. Their conversation was interrupted by Jennifer's arrival, carrying a folder thick with legal documents related to the Morrison chemical case. Her expression was serious, but excited, the look of someone who was about to deliver news that was both challenging and rewarding. Maya, the attorneys want to schedule your deposition for next Thursday. The evidence you compiled is going to be central to proving that Morrison Chemical knew about the groundwater contamination and actively covered it up. Your documentation of regulatory violations and health code infractions is more comprehensive than anything the legal team has seen in similar cases. Maya felt a complex mix of pride and anxiety. This validation of her professional work is exactly what she needed to rebuild confidence in her judgment and expertise. At the same time, the high-profile nature of the case meant increased scrutiny of her personal life, potential questions about her mental health, and the possibility that Rachel's accusations might be raised by defense attorneys trying to discredit her testimony. Are there any concerns about my personal situation affecting my credibility as a witness? Maya asked directly. She had learned from Dr. Chen that addressing difficult topics head-on was often less anxiety-provoking than letting them remain unspoken. Jennifer and David exchanged a look that told Maya that they had already discussed this potential issue. The legal team is aware of what happened with your sister, Jennifer said carefully.
They've reviewed the hospital records that exonerated you and the timeline that shows your research was completed before any personal crisis occurred. If anything, they think your ability to maintain professional standards while dealing with family manipulation actually strengthens your credibility. Maya felt something tight in her chest release slightly. For months, she had worried that Rachel's accusations would permanently damage her reputation, that people would always wonder whether there had been some truth to claims about her mental instability. To hear that her professional standing was not only intact, but potentially enhanced by how she had handled the crisis, was profoundly healing. There's something else, Jennifer continued. The Morrison Chemical legal team has been doing background research on everyone involved in the case, including you. They discovered the timeline of your sister's accusations and hospitalization, and they're apparently concerned that their defense strategy might be compromised if they try to attack your mental health. David laughed, a sound that held both irony and satisfaction. So, Rachel's attempt to destroy your credibility actually ended up protecting you from corporate lawyers who might have tried to discredit your testimony through other means. Maya shook her head in amazement. My sister tried to have me committed to prevent me from exposing corporate wrongdoing, but her illness was so obvious that it actually validated my work and made me a stronger witness against the company she was supposedly trying to protect me from. It was the kind of circular irony that would have been funny if it weren't so tragic. Rachel's paranoid delusions had been focused on protecting Maya from dangers that existed only in her fractured mind. But the real danger had been Rachel herself, her illness, her manipulation, her betrayal of the trust that had anchored Maya's sense of reality. As Jennifer and David left her office to prepare for other meetings, Maya sat quietly for a few minutes, processing the morning's conversations. She realized that for the first time since Rachel's breakdown, she was feeling genuinely excited about something. The opportunity to see the Morrison Chemical case through to completion, to watch corporate polluters be held accountable for their actions, to have her months of careful research validated in a court of law. But alongside the excitement was a persistent sadness about sharing this professional triumph with Rachel. In the life Maya had imagined before her sister's illness, this would have been the kind of success they celebrated together. Rachel would have been proud of Maya's work, supportive of her involvement in holding corporations accountable, eager to hear about every development in the legal proceedings. Instead, Rachel was in a psychiatric ward, convinced that bird flight patterns were carrying messages from their dead mother,
asking doctors to contact people who had been dead for years. The sister who should have been Maya's strongest advocate had become the person who nearly destroyed her career and her sense of self. Maya's phone buzzed with a text from Dr. Chen. "Looking forward to our session this afternoon. Remember to bring the list we discussed about potential benefits and risks of visiting Rachel." The list. Maya had been working on it for 2 weeks, trying to organize her thoughts about whether and when to participate in family therapy sessions with her sister. Dr. Chen had suggested that writing down her concerns and hopes might help clarify what she needed before she could safely engage with Rachel again. The benefits list was short and shallow: potential closure, opportunity to understand Rachel's perspective, chance to rebuild some form of relationship with her only remaining family member, possible healing for those sisters. The risks list was much longer and more detailed: Rachel's potential to manipulate or gaslight her again, the possibility of regression in Maya's own healing process, the chance that Rachel might not be stable enough for productive conversation, the risk of feeling responsible for Rachel's mental health, the fear that seeing Rachel's current condition might traumatize Maya or trigger her own anxiety symptoms.
Maya pulled out the notebook where she had been working on these lists, reviewing the items she had added over the past 2 weeks. Her handwriting looked shaky in some places, evidence of the emotional difficulty of this exercise. But Dr. Chen had been right that putting her thoughts on paper helped clarify the decision-making process. At the bottom of the risks list, Maya had written, "What if she's not really sorry? What if her illness means she can't understand what she did to me? What if I forgive her and she hurts me again?" These were the questions that kept Maya awake at night, staring at her bedroom ceiling while her mind cycled through scenarios and possibilities. Rachel's requests to see her could be genuine remorse and desire for reconciliation, or they could be symptoms of her illness, attempts to draw Maya back into a dynamic where Rachel held power over her emotions and decisions. The lunch hour found Maya in Riverside Park, the same place where she and Rachel had often met for picnics and conversations throughout their adult lives. The park held layers of memory: childhood visits with their parents, teenage heart-to-heart talks after difficult breakups, recent celebrations of Maya's professional achievements. Now it felt like a place where she could think about Rachel without the clinical atmosphere of hospitals or the professional demands of her office. Maya sat on a bench near the pond, watching ducks glide across the water's surface. Their movements were peaceful and purposeful, unlike the frantic flight patterns that Rachel now interpreted as coded messages from the dead. Maya wondered if her sister had always been vulnerable to this kind of magical thinking, or if stress and isolation had gradually worn down her ability to distinguish between meaningful patterns and random coincidences. Their mother had loved this park, had brought both daughters here regularly to observe seasonal changes in the ecosystem and to talk about environmental conservation. Elena had been the kind of person who could find wonder in small natural phenomena: the way morning light reflected off water, the complexity of bird migration patterns, the intricate relationships between plants and soil and weather. It occurred to Maya that Rachel's delusions might be a twisted version of their mother's environmental consciousness, a way of trying to reconnect with Elena's wisdom and guidance through the natural world. In her illness, Rachel had transformed their mother's scientific curiosity into supernatural communication, her appreciation for nature's complexity into evidence of hidden messages and secret meanings. Maya's phone rang, pulling her away from these reflections. The caller ID showed Dr. Morrison from the hospital, and Maya felt her heart rate accelerate. Calls from the psychiatric ward usually meant crisis or important updates about Rachel's condition. "Maya, I'm calling because Rachel has had a significant change in her symptoms over the past 24 hours. She's been more lucid and coherent, and she's specifically asking to record a message for you. We think this might represent the beginning of insight into her illness." Maya gripped the phone tighter. What kind of message? Is she stable enough for that kind of conversation? She wants to apologize. But more than that, she wants to explain what she was thinking during the period when she was making accusations against you.
She seems to understand now that her perceptions were distorted by illness, and she's expressing genuine remorse for the impact her actions had on your life. Maya felt tears prick at her eyes. This was what she had been hoping for and dreading in equal measure. The possibility that Rachel might recover enough to understand what she had done, to acknowledge the harm she had caused, to take responsibility for choices made while she was sick. Is this real insight, or is it possible that this is just another symptom? I mean, could she be saying these things because her illness is making her feel guilty, or because she's trying to manipulate me again? Dr. Morrison was quiet for a moment, considering the question. Insight development in patients with schizophrenia can be gradual and sometimes fragmented. It's possible that Rachel is experiencing genuine understanding of her actions while still maintaining some delusional beliefs about other topics. We've been monitoring her carefully, and her remorse seems authentic and proportionate to the situation.
Maya stared across the pond, watching the ducks dive beneath the surface and emerge in different locations. What would happen if I listened to this message? Would I have to respond? Would she expect to see me afterward? You would have complete control over the interaction, Dr. Morrison assured her. You could listen to the recording privately, with no obligation to respond or to visit. Think of it as information that might help you make decisions about future contact, rather than a request that requires immediate action. After ending the call, Maya sat in the park for another hour, trying to process this unexpected development. Rachel's potential insight into her illness was positive for her recovery, but it also meant Maya would have to confront the reality of her sister's understanding about what she had done. It was easier, in some ways, to think of Rachel as completely delusional, unable to comprehend the harm she had caused. The possibility that Rachel might fully understand her betrayal made the whole situation more complex and emotionally charged. Maya realized she needed to talk through this decision with Dr. Chen before making any commitments about listening to Rachel's message. The afternoon therapy session would provide a space to explore her reactions to this development and to consider what emotional preparation she might need before hearing Rachel's apology. The drive back to work felt surreal, as if the familiar streets and buildings belonged to someone else's life. Maya found herself noticing details she usually overlooked, the way shadows fell across storefronts, the patterns created by traffic lights and street signs, the movements of birds overhead. She wondered if this heightened awareness was what Rachel experienced constantly, the sense that every visual element might contain hidden meaning or important information. At Evergreen Environmental, Maya tried to focus on preparing for the Morrison chemical deposition, but her concentration kept drifting to thoughts about Rachel's message. What would her sister say? Would she take full responsibility for her actions, or would she try to minimize the harm by emphasizing her illness? Would she ask for forgiveness, or would she simply want Maya to understand her perspective? David stopped by her office again in the late afternoon, noticing her distracted state and offering to handle some of her preparatory work for the legal case. His kindness reminded Maya of how much her support network had expanded since Rachel's betrayal. Before her sister's illness, Maya had relied heavily on Rachel for emotional support and guidance. Now she had relationships with Dr. Chen, with David and Jennifer, with Mrs. Patterson, with other friends and colleagues who had rallied around her during the crisis. I got a call from the hospital. Rachel wants to record an apology message for me. The doctors think she's developing insight into her illness. David's expression grew serious. How do you feel about that possibility? Maya realized she had been asking herself the wrong question. Instead of wondering whether she should listen to Rachel's message, she should be asking herself what she hoped to gain from hearing it and what she feared might happen as a result. I think I want to hear what she has to say, Maya said slowly, but I'm afraid that listening to her apology might make me feel obligated to forgive her before I'm ready, or that it might reopen emotional wounds that have started to heal. David nodded thoughtfully. Maybe the question isn't whether to listen, but how to listen in a way that protects your emotional well-being. Like, what conditions would you need to feel safe hearing her message? This reframing felt helpful. She could listen to Rachel's recording with Dr. Chen present in the controlled environment of a therapy session where she would have immediate support for processing whatever emotions arose. She could set boundaries about not making any decisions about future contact until she had time to fully consider Rachel's words. She could approach the message as information rather than a request for immediate reconciliation. By the time Maya left work for her therapy appointment, she had decided to ask Dr. Chen about the possibility of listening to Rachel's message during their session. The decision felt both terrifying and necessary, a step toward understanding what had happened between the sisters and what might be possible in terms of future relationship. The therapy office was located in a converted Victorian house with soft lighting and comfortable furniture that created an atmosphere of safety and privacy. Dr. Chen was a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and a direct communication style that Maya had come to appreciate. She had specialized experience in treating trauma related to family betrayal and manipulation, which made her uniquely qualified to help Maya navigate the complex emotions surrounding Rachel's illness.
I can see something significant has happened since our last session, Dr. Chen said, as Maya settled into her usual chair. Your energy feels different today, more activated, maybe somewhat anxious. Maya described the call from Dr. Morrison and her conflicted feelings about listening to Rachel's recorded message. Dr. Chen listened carefully, asking clarifying questions about Maya's fears and hopes regarding her sister's potential insight. What concerns me, Dr. Chen said finally, is that you seem to be focusing primarily on Rachel's recovery process rather than your own healing needs. Rachel's development of insight is positive for her treatment, but it doesn't automatically create safety or readiness for you to engage with her. This observation felt like a revelation. Maya realized she had been unconsciously measuring her own progress by Rachel's improvement, as if her sister's recovery would somehow undo the trauma of betrayal or make reconciliation inevitable. I think I've been waiting for Rachel to get better so that I can feel normal again. Like her illness created this crisis, so her recovery should resolve it. Dr. Chen noted, but your trauma isn't dependent on Rachel's mental health status. Even if she makes a full recovery, even if she develops complete insight and takes full responsibility for her actions, you'll still need to process the impact of what happened to you. Her apology might be part of your healing process, but it can't substitute for the work you need to do to rebuild trust in your own perceptions and to develop healthy boundaries in your relationship with her. They spent the remainder of the session exploring what Maya would need before she could safely listen to Rachel's message. The list included having Dr. Chen present for support, setting a specific time limit for the recording, agreeing in advance that hearing the message wouldn't create any obligation for immediate response or future contact, and preparing coping strategies for whatever emotions might arise. I want to hear what she has to say, but I want to hear it on my terms, in a safe environment with support available. I don't want her illness or her recovery to control the pace of my own healing process. As Maya drove home from therapy, she felt a sense of clarity about the decision to listen to Rachel's message. It wouldn't be easy, and it might reopen difficult emotions, but it was a choice she was making from a position of strength rather than obligation. She had learned to distinguish between compassion and codependency, between forgiveness and trust, between understanding someone's illness and excusing their harmful actions. The evening routine of dinner, reading, and preparation for the next day felt more manageable than it had in weeks. Maya realized that having a plan to deal with Rachel's message had reduced the anxiety that came from uncertainty and lack of control. Tomorrow, she would call Dr. Morrison and arrange to listen to the recording during her next therapy session. She would face whatever Rachel had to say with support, boundaries, and a clear understanding of her own needs and limits. As she prepared for bed, Maya looked out her bedroom window at the same view she had observed every night for 5 years.
The streetlights created familiar patterns of light and shadow. The neighbor's porch light was on, as always, and somewhere in the distance, she could hear the sound of traffic and the occasional call of nightbirds. For the first time since Rachel's breakdown, these ordinary sights and sounds felt peaceful rather than ominous. Maya was beginning to trust her own perceptions again, to feel confident in her ability to distinguish between meaningful patterns and random coincidence, between genuine concern and manipulation, between love and control. The woman who would listen to Rachel's message next week was not the same person who had been ambushed by accusations of mental illness 3 months ago. She was stronger, more aware of her own needs, more skilled at recognizing red flags in relationships.
When Rachel had to say, Maya would hear it as someone who had learned to protect herself while remaining open to the possibility of healing. The recording arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered to Dr. Chen's office in a sealed envelope marked with hospital protocols and Maya's name written in Dr. Morrison's careful handwriting. Maya sat in the familiar therapy chair, staring at the small digital device that contained her sister's voice, her apology, her attempt to explain the inexplicable betrayal that had shattered both their lives. "We can stop at any point," Dr. Chen reminded her, settling into her own chair with a notepad and the kind of calm presence that had become Maya's anchor through months of recovery. "This is entirely your choice, and you have complete control over how much you hear and how you respond." Maya nodded, her thumb hovering over the play button. 3 weeks had passed since Dr. Morrison's call about Rachel's emerging insight. 3 weeks of sleepless nights and anxiety dreams and the constant weight of decision-making. The Morrison chemical deposition had gone well. Better than well, actually. Maya's testimony had been clear, confident, and devastating to the defense's attempts to discredit the environmental evidence. The legal team had praised her composure and expertise, and the local newspaper had run a feature story about her role in exposing corporate environmental crimes. But even professional vindication couldn't erase the ache of wondering what Rachel might say about the months leading up to her psychiatric breakdown, about the calculated cruelty of her accusations, about the sister she had been before illness transformed love into weaponized manipulation. Maya pressed play. Rachel's voice filled the room, and it was simultaneously familiar and strange, thinner than Maya remembered, with a tremor that spoke of medication and emotional exhaustion, but recognizably her sister beneath the surface changes. "Maya, I know you might not ever listen to this, and I know you have every right to hate me forever. But Dr. Morrison said I should try to explain what was happening in my mind during those months when I was sick and didn't know it." Maya felt tears prick at her eyes immediately. This was the Rachel she remembered from childhood. Honest, direct, willing to take responsibility for her mistakes. But the voice also carried weight that hadn't been there before. The gravity of someone who had looked into the abyss of her own mind and found things that terrified her. "I need you to understand that none of what I did was really about you. I know that sounds like an excuse, but it's not. It's the opposite. Everything I did to you was about the things happening inside my head that I couldn't control or understand." Maya reached for the tissues Dr. Chen kept on the side table, feeling the complexity of grief and relief and anger swirling together in her chest. Rachel sounded genuinely remorseful, but she also sounded fragile in a way that made Maya want to protect her, even while processing the harm she had caused. "It started about 6 months before I tried to have you committed," Rachel's voice went on. "I began having thoughts that didn't feel like my thoughts,
Like someone else was putting ideas in my head about danger and threats and people trying to hurt the people I loved. At first, I thought I was just being protective, just being a good sister. Dr. Chen made a note on her pad, and Maya realized she was holding her breath, waiting for Rachel to explain the inexplicable. The thoughts got worse when you started working on that water contamination case. I would lay awake at night with this absolute certainty that someone was going to hurt you, that your work was making you a target, and that I was the only person who could keep you safe. But the safety I thought you needed got all twisted up with these paranoid ideas about who was dangerous and what kinds of threats were real. Maya paused the recording, needing a moment to process what she was hearing. "She's describing the development of paranoid delusions," she said to Dr. Chen, "but she's describing them from the inside, from the perspective of someone who was experiencing them as reality."
Dr. Chen nodded. "What are you feeling as you listened to her description?" Maya considered the question carefully. Sad? Angry? Relieved that she understands now that those thoughts weren't real, but also scared, because I can hear how convinced she was that she was protecting me. It makes me understand how someone could justify doing terrible things if they really believed their loved one was in danger. She pressed play again. "I started researching your case obsessively, reading everything I could find about environmental consulting and corporate cover-ups and what happens to whistleblowers. But instead of seeing your work as important and legitimate, my sick brain started interpreting everything as evidence that you were in immediate danger. Every stressful day at work became proof that someone was targeting you. Every difficult conversation with your boss became evidence of a conspiracy." Maya felt a chill of recognition. Rachel was describing the exact distortions that had made her accusations seem so credible to hospital staff. She had taken real elements of Maya's professional life and twisted them into evidence of mental instability and paranoid thinking. "I convinced myself that you couldn't see the danger because you were too close to it, that your judgment was compromised by stress and overwork. I thought I was the only person who could see the situation clearly, the only one who could save you from whatever I imagined was coming. A psychiatric hospital seemed like the perfect safe house." Maya felt sick. The twisted logic was almost comprehensible when Rachel explained it this way, a paranoid delusion about protection that had manifested as betrayal, love transformed into something monstrous by illness. "I spent weeks building a case against you," Rachel continued, her voice now carrying obvious shame. "I went through your apartment, your computer, your personal journals, looking for evidence that you were becoming unstable. But I wasn't looking for real evidence of mental illness. I was looking for things I could present as mental illness to convince doctors to hospitalize you." Dr. Chen leaned forward slightly. "How are you processing this level of premeditation?" Maya wiped her eyes, feeling the complexity of understanding someone's actions without being able to forgive them. It's horrible and sad at the same time. She was so sick that she thought destroying my life was an act of love. But she was also coherent enough to plan and execute a complex deception. I don't know how to hold both of those things together. The recording continued with Rachel describing the weeks of preparation, how she had documented Maya's legitimate work stress as evidence of paranoia, how she had reframed Maya's thorough research methods as obsessive behavior, how she had taken conversations about the challenges of environmental consulting and presented them as delusional complaints about persecution. "I practiced what I was going to say to the doctors," Rachel admitted. "I rehearsed the concerned sister role, figured out how to sound worried but not hysterical, how to present the evidence in a way that would seem credible and objective." Maya felt anger rising in her chest, hot and righteous. The level of calculation Rachel was describing went beyond illness into something that felt intentionally cruel. Even if Rachel's motivations had been rooted in paranoid delusions, the execution of her plan had required sustained deception and manipulation.
I told myself that once you were safe in the hospital, I would be able to think clearly about how to protect you from the dangers I was imagining. I thought I would visit you every day, that we would work together to figure out how to handle the threats against you, that you would eventually thank me for saving your life. The recording stopped abruptly, and Maya could hear muffled crying in the background. When Rachel's voice returned, it was thick with tears and barely controlled emotion. Maya, I am so sorry. I am so fucking sorry for what I did to you. I know that being sick doesn't excuse the harm I caused. I know that good intentions don't erase the impact of terrible actions. I know that I betrayed your trust in the worst possible way, and I know that you might never be able to forgive me. Maya found herself crying openly now, feeling the full weight of grief for the relationship that had been lost, for the sister she had trusted completely, for the innocence that could never be recovered. The worst part is that I convinced myself I was being loving, Rachel continued. I thought I was the good sister, the protective one, the person who would do anything to keep you safe. I used our entire relationship history against you. Every time you had trusted me with your fears, every moment of vulnerability you had shared with me, every way that I knew you better than anyone else in the world. Dr. Chen handed Maya another tissue, her expression reflecting the complexity of what they were both witnessing, genuine remorse, and insight from someone who had caused profound harm, the painful process of a mind trying to understand its own capacity for betrayal. I want you to know that getting sick doesn't excuse what I did, but I also want you to understand that the person who tried to have you committed wasn't really me. It was this twisted, paranoid version of me that was so terrified of losing you that she was willing to destroy you to keep you safe. Maya paused the recording again, overwhelmed by the emotional intensity of Rachel's explanation. I believe that she's sorry. I believe that she understands what she did and that she regrets it. But I don't know if that changes anything about how I feel or what I'm able to do with this relationship going forward. Dr. Chen nodded thoughtfully. Forgiveness and reconciliation are separate processes. You can understand Rachel's illness and appreciate her remorse without being ready to trust her again or to resume a close relationship. Maya realized this was exactly what she needed to hear. Rachel's apology was meaningful and seemed genuine, but it didn't create an obligation for Maya to immediately forgive or to return to their previous dynamic. Understanding the reasons for someone's actions didn't automatically heal the wounds those actions had created. She pressed play for the final portion of the recording. I know I have no right to ask anything of you, Rachel said, her voice steadier now but still heavy with emotion. But if you're ever willing to see me, if you're ever ready to talk about what happened, I want you to know that I will spend the rest of my life trying to make amends for what I did. Not because I think I can earn your forgiveness, but because you deserve to have your sister back, even if she's different now, even if she's someone who has to take medication and go to therapy and work every day to stay connected to reality. The recording ended with Rachel saying Maya's name one more time, softly, like a prayer or an apology or a goodbye. Maya and Dr. Chen sat in silence for several minutes, allowing the weight of Rachel's words to settle between them. Maya felt emotionally drained, but also strangely relieved. The apology hadn't erased her anger or her grief, but it had provided answers to questions that had been haunting her for months. "What are you thinking?" Dr. Chen asked gently. Maya took a deep breath, trying to organize her thoughts. I'm thinking that Rachel was sicker than I realized, but also more calculating than I wanted to believe. I'm thinking that I understand her actions better now, but that understanding doesn't make them less harmful. And I'm thinking that I might be ready to see her at some point, but not yet. Dr. Chen made notes on her pad. What would need to be different for you to feel ready for an in-person conversation?
Maya considered this question carefully. I would need to feel confident that I could maintain my boundaries with her, that I wouldn't get pulled back into feeling responsible for her emotional well-being. I would need to know that she's stable enough for the conversation to be productive rather than re-traumatizing. And I would need to have a clear understanding of what I hoped to accomplish by seeing her. Over the following weeks, Maya found herself returning to Rachel's recorded apology in her thoughts, processing different aspects of what her sister had shared. The revelation that Rachel had spent weeks planning her accusations was particularly difficult to integrate. It suggested a level of intentionality that went beyond the impulsive actions of someone in the grip of acute mental illness. At the same time, Maya could hear the genuine remorse in Rachel's voice, the evidence of insight into her illness and its impact. The sister who had made the recording was clearly different from the woman who had tried to have Maya committed, more vulnerable, more aware of her own fragility, more capable of taking responsibility for her actions. Maya's daily routine began to include what she privately called Rachel processing time, periods where she allowed herself to think about her sister without judgment, to feel whatever emotions arose without trying to fix or resolve them immediately. Sometimes this meant crying in her car after work. Sometimes it meant writing long letters to Rachel that she never intended to send. Sometimes it meant calling Dr. Chen for emergency sessions when the grief felt overwhelming. The Morrison chemical case concluded with a settlement that exceeded everyone's expectations. The chemical company agreed to fund extensive environmental remediation and to pay damages to affected community members. Maya's role in the victory was recognized with a commendation from her company and a feature article in a national environmental magazine. But the professional success felt bittersweet without Rachel to share it with. In the life Maya had imagined before her sister's breakdown, this would have been a moment of celebration, a validation of everything Maya had worked toward in her environmental consulting career. Rachel would have been proud, supportive, eager to hear every detail about the legal proceedings and the community impact. Instead, Maya celebrated quietly with David and Jennifer, acknowledging the victory while mourning the relationship that should have been part of it. 6 weeks after listening to Rachel's recording, Maya received another call from Dr. Morrison. Rachel had continued to show improvement in her treatment with decreased paranoid symptoms and increased insight into her illness. She was asking about the possibility of supervised visits with Maya, but only if Maya felt ready for that level of contact. She specifically said that she doesn't want to pressure you. She understands that her recovery doesn't automatically create readiness for you to engage with her. She's willing to wait as long as necessary for you to feel safe and prepared. Maya appreciated Rachel's apparent respect for her boundaries, but she also felt the familiar weight of having to make decisions about someone else's mental health treatment. Even Rachel's consideration for Maya's needs felt like a form of emotional responsibility that Maya wasn't sure she was ready to carry. What would a supervised visit look like? What kind of support would be available, and what kind of protections would be in place? Dr. Morrison described a structured process that would begin with very brief meetings in the hospital's family therapy room, with a social worker present throughout the interaction. Maya would have complete control over the length and frequency of visits, with no obligation to continue if the experience became overwhelming or counterproductive. The goal wouldn't be immediate reconciliation. It would be to provide a safe space for both of you to begin processing what happened and to explore whether some form of ongoing relationship is possible and healthy.
Maya realized she was ready to consider this possibility, not because she had forgiven Rachel or because she felt obligated to repair their relationship, but because she had reached a level of personal stability that allowed her to engage with her sister without losing herself in the process. "I want to think about it for another week," Maya told Dr. Morrison, "and I want to discuss the details with my therapist before making any commitments, but I think I might be ready to see her." That evening, Maya called Mrs. Patterson to update her on the situation and to ask for advice from someone who had observed the sisters' relationship from the outside. Mrs. Patterson listened carefully to Maya's description of Rachel's apology and her consideration of supervised visits. "Honey, you've got good instincts about people," Mrs. Patterson said finally. "Trust yourself to know whether your sister is ready to be safe around you, and trust yourself to know whether you're ready to be around her. Nobody else can make that decision for you, not the doctors or the therapists or even Rachel herself." Maya realized this was exactly the permission she needed, not to see Rachel, but to trust her own judgment about when and whether to rebuild their relationship. For months, she had been looking to external authorities for guidance about how to handle her sister's illness and recovery. Now she understood that the most important authority was her own sense of safety and readiness. The decision to visit Rachel would be hers to make, in her own time, on her own terms, with her own support systems in place. Whatever happened next in their relationship would be built on Maya's newfound understanding of her own worth, her right to protection from harm, and her capacity to love someone while still maintaining healthy boundaries. Maya Chen was an environmental scientist on the verge of exposing a major corporate cover-up when her world collapsed in the most unexpected way. The Morrison Chemical Company had been illegally dumping toxic waste into local waterways, and Maya's research was about to bring their crimes to light. But instead of corporate retaliation, the attack came from someone she trusted most, her own sister. Rachel, Maya's older sister and closest confidant, had been experiencing the early stages of paranoid schizophrenia. In her deteriorating mental state, Rachel became convinced that Maya was in mortal danger from corporate assassins. What started as normal, sisterly concern twisted into something sinister as Rachel's paranoid delusions took hold. Believing she was protecting Maya from imaginary threats, Rachel systematically built a case against her sister's mental health. She went through Maya's personal belongings, her computer, her journals, turning Maya's private thoughts and professional dedication into evidence of paranoid delusions. Rachel presented Maya's legitimate environmental research as proof of conspiracy theories, her work stress as signs of mental breakdown. The betrayal was methodical and devastating. Rachel used their entire relationship history as ammunition, weaponizing every vulnerable conversation, every fear Maya had shared, every moment of trust between them. She contacted her colleagues, her supervisor, even her therapist, painting a picture of a woman losing touch with reality. The culmination of Rachel's campaign came when Maya found herself involuntarily committed to a psychiatric hospital. Stripped of her freedom, her credibility destroyed, Maya faced the horrifying reality that the person who knew her best had used that knowledge to convince everyone she was mentally ill. In the sterile hospital environment, Maya struggled to maintain her sense of reality, while medical professionals treated her as unstable and potentially dangerous. The environmental case she had worked so hard to build seemed lost forever. Her professional reputation lay in ruins. Most devastating of all, she began to question her own perceptions and judgment. During her hospitalization, Maya slowly pieced together what had happened. She realized that Rachel's protective instincts had been hijacked by mental illness, transforming love into betrayal. The sister who had always been her closest ally had become her greatest threat, not out of malice, but out of a twisted desire to keep her safe from dangers that existed only in Rachel's paranoid mind.
Maya's path to healing was complex and painful. She had to recover not just from the trauma of involuntary hospitalization, but from the deeper wound of family betrayal. Through therapy with Dr. Chen, Maya learned to process the complex emotions surrounding Rachel's actions. The anger, grief, confusion, and underneath it all, a persistent love that no amount of betrayal could completely erase. The recovery process involved rebuilding her sense of reality and learning to trust her own perceptions again. Maya had to separate her legitimate environmental concerns from the paranoid narrative Rachel had constructed around them. She had to reclaim her professional identity and fight to restore her credibility in the scientific community. Meanwhile, Rachel was receiving treatment for her schizophrenia. As medication controlled her paranoid symptoms and therapy helped her develop insight into her illness, Rachel began to understand the magnitude of what she had done. The growing awareness of her actions filled her with devastating guilt and shame. 3 months after Maya's release from the hospital, Rachel made a recorded apology that revealed the depth of her understanding about the harm she had caused. In her message, Rachel took full responsibility for her actions while explaining the paranoid thought processes that had driven her betrayal. Rachel described how her normal sisterly concern had escalated into overwhelming terror that Maya was in physical danger from corporate enemies. She explained how her illness had created a distorted moral framework where betraying Maya's trust seemed like a necessary sacrifice to save her life. The apology was both heartbreaking and illuminating, evidence of love twisted into something monstrous by mental illness. After months of therapy and careful consideration, Maya made the courageous decision to visit Rachel in the psychiatric hospital. This wasn't about forgiveness or obligation. It was about Maya's confidence that she could face her sister without losing herself in the process. Their first supervised meeting was emotionally charged, but ultimately healing. Rachel demonstrated genuine insight into her illness and sincere remorse for her actions. She acknowledged that she had used their entire relationship history against Maya, weaponizing decades of trust and intimacy. Most importantly, she accepted that she might never deserve forgiveness. Maya, in turn, was able to articulate the full scope of harm Rachel had caused, not just the violation of privacy, but the systematic undermining of her credibility, reality, and sense of self. The conversation allowed both sisters to begin processing the trauma while establishing new boundaries for any future relationship. Remarkably, Maya's traumatic experience became the foundation for extraordinary professional success. The psychological skills she developed during recovery, trusting her own perceptions, recognizing manipulation tactics, maintaining boundaries under pressure, proved invaluable in her environmental advocacy work. Corporate entities that engage in environmental cover-ups often use similar tactics to those employed in psychological manipulation, questioning data, undermining credibility, isolating advocates from support systems, and making them doubt their own perceptions. Maya's personal experience with these dynamics made her uniquely effective at recognizing and countering corporate intimidation. The Morrison chemical case, which had nearly been destroyed by Rachel's sabotage, ultimately resulted in a major victory. Maya's consulting firm grew into a successful practice specializing in environmental justice cases, with particular expertise in supporting advocates who faced various forms of retaliation. Over the following 18 months, Maya and Rachel slowly rebuilt their connection through supervised visits, family therapy sessions, and carefully structured communication. The process was gradual and often difficult, but both sisters remained committed to creating something new from the ashes of their destroyed relationship. Rachel made remarkable progress in treatment, developing insight into her illness and taking responsibility for her actions. She began working in peer support, using her experience with mental illness to help others navigate their own recovery journeys. Her intelligence and compassion, qualities that had made her an effective sister before her illness, were channeled into meaningful work helping people who faced similar challenges. The relationship they rebuilt was different from their previous sisterhood, more cautious, more boundaried, but genuinely loving within those limits. Maya learned to love Rachel safely, with full awareness of the risks and benefits involved. She maintained her own support systems and continued therapy to process the ongoing complexity of their relationship.
Rachel channeled her experience into research about family impact of psychotic episodes, working with Dr. Morrison to document how mental illness affects relationships. Her case study, developed with Maya's permission, provided insights into the subjective experience of psychosis that most family members never access. Rachel's research revealed crucial distinctions between insight development and symptom control. She could take medication that prevented paranoid delusions, but learning to understand the impact of her actions while sick was a much longer and more complex process. Her work began helping other families understand that relatives who betray trust during psychotic episodes aren't necessarily malicious. They're often trying to express love in ways that become harmful because of their illness. Just as Maya and Rachel were finding their footing in their rebuilt relationship, tragedy struck again. Rachel was diagnosed with aggressive cancer that had spread extensively throughout her body. The doctors gave her 6 months to live. This new crisis tested everything they had learned about loving each other safely. Maya participated in Rachel's medical care while maintaining her boundaries and continuing her own therapy. The irony was devastating. They had survived mental illness, betrayal, and the long process of rebuilding trust only to face terminal cancer. Rachel's final months were marked by continued growth and grace. She expressed gratitude for the opportunity to make amends for her actions and found meaning in the knowledge that her story was helping other families navigate similar crises. Her death was peaceful, with Maya present, sharing stories about their childhood and their mother's love for both of them. Maya's story didn't end with Rachel's death. Instead, it evolved into a powerful platform for advocacy and education. She became a sought-after speaker and consultant, sharing insights about the intersection of personal trauma and professional resilience. Maya founded the Environmental Justice Institute, a nonprofit organization that provides comprehensive support for communities and advocates facing corporate environmental crimes. The institute combines traditional environmental consulting with mental health resources, legal advocacy, and community organizing, a holistic approach reflecting Maya's understanding of interconnected environmental and psychological resilience. She also developed a consulting practice around family mental health crises, particularly situations involving paranoid delusions and betrayal between family members. Her insights proved valuable for hospital staff, family therapists, and other mental health professionals dealing with similar cases. Maya's daughter Elena, named for both grandmothers, grew up with awareness of mental illness as a treatable medical condition while also learning about boundaries, self-advocacy, and trusting her own perceptions. Elena inherited Maya's scientific curiosity and environmental consciousness, eventually becoming Dr. Elena Chen, a professor of environmental psychology. Her research focused on the psychological impact of environmental activism on families, particularly when corporate interests exploit family dynamics to silence advocates. Her work represented the next generation of this advocacy, more systematic and academically rigorous, but grounded in personal understanding of how environmental advocacy and family mental health intersect. Maya's journey revealed profound truths about love, forgiveness, and healing. She learned that healing from betrayal doesn't require forgiveness, and forgiveness doesn't require trust. These are separate processes that happen on different timelines and may never fully resolve.
She discovered how to love someone with boundaries, with support systems in place, and with clear understanding of her own limits and needs. She learned to love Rachel as she was in recovery, not as she had been before her illness, or as Maya hoped she might become. The story illustrates that forgiveness isn't a single decision, but an ongoing process of choosing not to be defined by someone else's actions. Maya never fully trusted Rachel again, but she found ways to maintain a meaningful relationship within protective boundaries. Maya's professional achievements grew directly from her personal trauma. Her environmental consulting firm expanded into a major force for environmental justice, with her unique expertise in recognizing and countering psychological manipulation making her particularly effective against corporate intimidation tactics. She became a frequent speaker at conferences, sharing insights about resilience and advocacy. Her presentations emphasized how the same psychological tools needed for personal trauma recovery, trusting your own perceptions, maintaining boundaries, building support networks, are essential for environmental advocates facing corporate pressure. Rachel's story continued helping families long after her death. Her research became part of standard training for mental health professionals dealing with family betrayal trauma. The insights she developed about the intersection of love and betrayal under the influence of mental illness helped countless families navigate similar crises. Maya regularly consulted on cases involving family members who had betrayed loved ones during psychiatric episodes. Each consultation reinforced her understanding of how personal trauma could become professional expertise when channeled thoughtfully and ethically. 15 years after Rachel's initial betrayal, Maya received an honorary doctorate recognizing her contributions to both environmental justice and family mental health advocacy. In her commencement address, she reflected on the unexpected transformation of her life's trajectory. The trauma that had once threatened to define her had become a source of strength that enabled her to help others navigate their own darkest moments. The relationship that had been irrevocably damaged by mental illness had been rebuilt into something different but meaningful. The sister who had tried to destroy her life had inadvertently equipped her with tools for protecting other advocates and families. Maya realized that Rachel's true legacy wasn't the harm she had caused during her illness, but the healing and advocacy work that had emerged from their shattered relationship. In learning to love her sister safely, Maya had learned to love herself fully. In rebuilding trust after betrayal, she had developed unshakable confidence in her own perceptions and judgment. The story demonstrates that even the most devastating betrayals can become sources of wisdom and strength when processed with appropriate support and professional guidance. It shows how mental illness can distort love into something harmful, but also how recovery, insight, and genuine remorse can create possibilities for healing that seemed impossible. Maya's journey from victim to advocate, from broken sister to boundary-setting survivor, from isolated trauma victim to confident professional helping others, illustrates the incredible resilience of the human spirit and the potential for transformation that exists even in our darkest moments.
The intersection of family mental health and environmental advocacy in Maya's story highlights connections that are rarely explored in depth. Her insights about corporate manipulation tactics and psychological resilience have practical applications for advocates in many fields who face intimidation and attempts to discredit their work. Bringing you these powerful, true stories demands extensive time and effort to investigate and present respectfully. If Maya's story of surviving family betrayal has impacted you, please like, share, and subscribe for more incredible stories of human resilience, how families can navigate mental health crises while maintaining love and boundaries, and how environmental advocacy intersects with psychological resilience. Maya's story reminds us that even in our darkest moments, the seeds of transformation are being planted. Her journey from psychiatric patient to renowned advocate shows that our greatest challenges can become our most powerful tools for creating positive change in the world.